Hello and welcome to my short little video on textual superposition and a bit of consensus reality. Technically, textual superposition should be first on this slide, but it looked better this way round, so it is what it is. Anyway, this is a slightly extended version of a talk I'll be giving at the Communicate to Inspire conference on the 9th of July 2025. Although I suspect most of the viewers of this video will be coming from that conference, so for you it's an extended version of the talk I already gave in the future. Anyway, times two. I'm going to present this research in a slightly unconventional way. I'm going to start with a bit of the discussion and then work my way back to the background. So the first thing we need to do is rehash a few basic concepts of literary critique. We start with a text. The text was written by an author. If you want to know why the author is behind a gravestone, go watch my earlier video, How to Kill an Author. Back to the point, the text was written for some audience. Now we have a choice as to how we'll critique the text. We could do a close reading, where we assume that everything important about the text is in the text. One lens through which we might perform a close reading is new criticism, which is not all that new, having first emerged in the 1940s. Although that's just one example, you could also perform a close reading through a formalist or structuralist lens. We could also perform an authorial reading, where we try to figure out the author's intent to give the text meaning. The aptly named Intentionalism is an example of a lens through which we might reach an authorial reading. Then there's also a contextual reading, where we, the audience, attribute our own meaning to the text. Reception theory and reader response theory are both lenses that get us to a contextual reading. But it doesn't end there. That's only one axis of literary critique. A second axis includes adaptations made by the audience. Those might include fan fiction, adaptations into different media, and many other new interpretations of the text. Our second axis also includes the catalogue of all the author's work and the genre of the text. Genre is a bit fuzzier than the other two, since it's really just a set of expectations that project onto any work with a given label. But it's still relevant because this second axis is the comparative axis, where we critique a text by comparing it to others. Once again, these blue labels are just examples of the lenses that might get us to a type of reading, not the only way there. Then finally, we have a third axis, which is the axis of culture, history, and society. These are much larger structures that influence both the author and the audience, and therefore everything they think and feel. Some readings you might be able to perform through this axis are post-colonial readings, feminist readings, queer readings, neurodivergent readings, and many, many others. I've grouped those last three together under critical readings, largely because you can also perform a critical reading by considering your own positionality as opposed to the changing norms, values, and power structures over time that you'd consider through critical theory. If you went via your own positionality, you might consider it to be a sort of second-order contextual reading. I think it's also relevant to point out that all the comparative readings are in some way folkloric, but I'm not going to get into that here. If you want to learn a little more about folklore and how it works, I've written 7 articles for Campfire Technologies' online magazine, Campfire Learn, which I'll link to in the description. And now for our regularly scheduled quantum mechanics interlude. I promise it's relevant. So, a very basic idea in science, no matter what field you're in, is that you can't know what state something is in unless you observe it. Like if I walked into a room I've never been in before and the walls are blue. I didn't know that until I observed it. However, the walls were blue before I observed them. In quantum mechanics, it's a little different. When you observe a quantum particle, you'll often change its state. Like in the case of an electron, when you observe it, you'll only ever observe it in the spin-up or spin-down energy levels, but it can actually exist in an infinite number of other states. For simplicity, let's pretend that spin-up is an arrow on the y-axis of a Cartesian plane, and spin-down is an arrow on the x-axis. We can point an arrow in any direction from the origin, and that's a valid state. It's also a state that we can get to by adding together linear combinations of our base states, which in our case are our spin up arrow along the y-axis and our spin down arrow along the x-axis. Simple, right? No need to overcomplicate it with all that cat is both dead and alive wibbliness. From a more classical standpoint, we can consider superposition as any sum of two or more states, in the sense that if we have some input A that produces an output C and an input B that produces an output D, then the input A plus B will produce the output C plus D. All of this applies in some way to the lovely diagram we made earlier. This is what I call the probabilistic textual superposition. By that I mean this is a set of textual critique basis states all added together into one big superposition. This is where we diverge significantly from quantum mechanics. In quantum mechanics, we would observe this superposition and it would collapse into just one of the 7 basis states, or basis positionalities if you prefer, represented by our 7 images. That's not what happens here. Here, we observe the text by critiquing or interpreting it through a set of lenses of our own choosing. So we might choose a textual lens and an authorial lens, with the textual lens being maybe 4 times the size of the authorial lens. That will collapse our probabilistic textual superposition down to a real textual superposition that's 80% close reading and 20% authorial reading. Obviously, we can't actually measure those percentages in real literary critique, but I've included them for the sake of the example. So, by observing the text through our critical lenses, we collapse the textual superposition. But unlike in quantum mechanics, it will still be a superposition, unless you're dead set on critiquing a text from just one basis positionality. Now, why did I start with all this talk on literary critique? It's because one of the conclusions of my research is that in a 10-minute conversation, it takes only 5 facts to irreversibly collapse the textual superposition. That is, I think you'll agree, a bold claim. So, I'm going to prove it to you. Let's go back to the beginning. A question I was interested in answering, going into my master's research, was, how does world building affect interpretation? I'm a big fan of fantasy and science fiction, so I get very invested in world building. There was a problem with this question, though. Interpretation isn't really measurable in any meaningful way. I mean, sure, if I used Q methodology or something similar, I could phrase the question like this, but I had a really strong desire to not use Q methodology, so I made the question more specific. How does world building affect meeting understanding? That's something I can figure out how to measure. I will elaborate on that later though, because right now, my research question still has a big problem. World building is not particularly measurable either, regardless of how much I'd like it to be. To solve this problem, I had to look to a text from all the way back in 1984, Fantasy and Mimesis by Catherine Hume. Mimesis is a very simple concept attributed to Plato. 1984 doesn't seem so old anymore. It's just the mimicry of the real world as we understand it, or if you prefer, it's a way of learning through experience and reality. Then we move on to fantasy, which Hume doesn't consider to be a genre, but rather a necessary counterpart to mimesis. Hume defines fantasy as any departure from our lived experience. I like to think of it as learning through imagination and sometimes learning through empathy. Something very important to consider about these two concepts, though, is that reality can be fantastic and fantasy can be mimetic. This isn't anything groundbreaking. Reality is fantastic when someone else's lived experience doesn't coincide with your own. Basically, they have real experiences that are fantastic to you. How fantasy can be mimetic requires a little more explanation. So Hume introduced a concept called consensus reality, which she defined as the reality we depend on for everyday action. Later scholars in literary studies and folkloristics have refined that definition to better reflect the reality that all our perspectives are situated in our own experiences. So a more current definition of consensus reality is the information, ideas, and beliefs that are consistent or perceived to be consistent between lived experiences. Let's think of this, for now, as a Venn diagram. It's reductive, but it gets the job done. Your experience is on one side, my experience is on the other side, and between us is our consensus reality. You also have a consensus reality with every text you read, including science fiction and fantasy novels. That's where world building comes in. World building fills the context gap between you and the characters in the story. You are expected to temporarily accept the story's world building into your consensus reality so that you can fully understand and appreciate the characters' journeys. That is when fantasy becomes mimetic. The same is true in communication. If I want to communicate specific messages to you, then I need you to accept some of my knowledge and understanding into your consensus reality, at least temporarily, in order to bridge a context gap between your reality and the messages I'm trying to communicate. To bridge that context gap, I'm providing exposition, and that is something we can measure. Now we have a research question we can actually answer. How does exposition affect meeting understanding? The first thing I had to do was generate some stories. Because this was technically supposed to be science communication research, I generated science stories. To do that, I interviewed 8 scientists with 4 structured interviews and 4 semi-structured interviews. The structured interviews all consisted of the same questions, which were, what's so interesting about insert topic here? What were the key findings of your research? Did anything surprise you? What are the implications of your research for your field? What are the implications more broadly? And is there anything that should be done in response to your findings? The semi-structured interviews all started with the question, tell me a bit about yourself. How did you get into insert topic of interview? Then each successive question was based on the last thing the interviewee said in their last response, which allowed them to continue the same line of thought. This was quite challenging for me as the interviewer because I had to constantly be thinking of questions to ask my interviewees in case they stopped talking at the end of that sentence. Then I had to let most of those questions slip away so I could replace them with new ones again and again until the interviewee actually stopped talking. Oh, and those little green letters on the slide, those are the titles of all my interviews. If it has an S at the end, it's a structured interview, and if it has a C at the end, it's semi-structured. Anyway, after each interview, I asked each scientist to write down the most important message they communicated in their interview, which was something they were told they'd be asked before the interview. This was to capture authorial intent. I sealed the responses in envelopes, so I couldn't be biased by them. And this will come back later. The next step was, by far, the most painfully boring part of the research. I manually transcribed each interview and split them into beats. I considered a new beat to start any time the interviewee introduced a new piece of information, changed what they were talking about, or provided a different interpretation of the same information. Then came the part where I measured exposition. I came up with a metric called expositional reliance, which is a measurement of the number of previously stated pieces of information that the audience needs to retain to understand the current beat. This is one of the graphs I produced using that metric. A good example of expositional reliance in everyday conversation is pronouns. We associate a person's name with a pronoun and then replace it with the pronoun later in the conversation as a shorthand that we understand only because we retain that association between the name and the pronoun. I actually also mapped character fortune and narrative tension, but those were relative scales, not absolute scales, and they're not relevant to this part of the research, except for the fact that they inspired me to come up with the expositional reliance metric, and my measurements of character fortune and narrative tension on relative scales were inspired by the work of Kurt Vonnegut and his unanimously rejected master's thesis. Moving on, next I calculated the time-weighted expositional reliance mean, or TWERM for short, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's the expositional reliance at each second of the interview divided by the total number of seconds in the interview. As you can see, the TWERM varied significantly between interviews, but was typically higher for semi-structured interviews than for structured interviews, with the notable exceptions of MBC and MPS. An obvious question is why I used TWERM and not or I guess maybe BWERM, beat-weighted expositional reliance mean. My justification is that we experience conversations in real time, and not as beats, so TWERM is more holistic than or BWERM, but also it really doesn't matter since the greatest difference between TWERM and values was 0.14 for interview HGS, which was also the greatest difference in terms of proportion at 6.5%. When the greatest difference is 6.5% and the average difference is 2.8%, I'm not particularly bothered. I also don't really want to use as a noun throughout any presentation I give on this research, just a personal preference there. On to the next step, lots and lots of waiting for responses to a survey where people watched the recording of an interview, then answered the question, what is the most important message from this interview? That is, if you could take only one message from the interview, what would it be? I matched each response with the parts of the interview they drew it from. In many cases, respondents synthesized information from multiple parts of the interview into a single message. Though there were also 4 respondents out of a total of 67 who didn't include any information from the interview they watched in their response, which made me mildly concerned for their comprehension skills. In this example graph, the blue columns represent audience interpretations. The darker the column, the higher the number of responses that included that information. Then the pink lines at the top and bottom represent the interviewee's intended message. As you can see in this example, interviewee MPC was quite successful in communicating at least part of their intent. As you can also see, some interviews had much more consistent audience interpretations than others. But why? To understand that, first we need to calculate the mean concurrence of each interview, which is the average proportion of audience interpretations that each individual interpretation is consistent with. If one response included any of the same information as another, I considered them to be concurrent, since they shared at least some meeting understanding. Each response was also considered to be concurrent with itself, which meant the minimum possible mean concurrence was 0.1 recurring, since some interviews had 9 responses and others had 8. I would have liked more, but I was seriously constrained by time. In fact, the time from when I got ethics approval to start interviewing scientists to when I had to submit my research was exactly 80 days. But back to the research, I averaged the concurrence of each response to each interview to get the mean concurrence. All the mean concurrence values are listed in the table on screen, which is not particularly helpful to anyone. So let's put it in a graph. TWERM versus mean concurrence. And damn, that's a strong correlation. A straight line up until a TWERM of just over 5 anyway, at which point we see a clear discontinuity. We can see that up to a TWERM of just over 5, the consistency of audience interpretations increases proportional to average expositional reliance, with a coefficient of determination of 0.91. And for anyone who's wondering, which might only be me, if we use instead of twirm, the value of r squared goes from 0.914 to 0.912. Or in other words, whether we use twirm or continues to be completely irrelevant. So rely more on exposition and you'll achieve greater meeting understanding, is what I would say if we didn't have this discontinuity. As I mentioned earlier, we need to fill a context gap if we want to communicate our intended messages. Our audience needs to accept our exposition into their consensus reality, at least temporarily. Each piece of exposition you add constructs the lens through which your audience views the text, or in this case, the interview. We can see down here on the graph, these interviewees have barely constructed a lens. In fact, the interviewees with the lowest twirm tended to repeat themselves throughout the interview, but they weren't repeating information that they considered important. Rather, it was the information that formed the lens through which they were interpreting their field that they were repeating. You can't use a lens to look at itself, so by repeating that information, they prevented themselves from properly collapsing the textual superposition. Then over here, the lens is too broad, too complicated. The audience has no idea what you actually want them to focus on. These were interviewees who constructed a lens so specific that the information that passed through it was almost meaningless. It's sort of like looking through a telescopic camera lens at a goat on a mountain. If you don't zoom in far enough, you only see a mountain. But if you zoom in too far, your entire field of view is taken up by a few hairs and you can't even tell that you're looking at a goat anymore. You need to make sure your lens is zoomed in just the right amount to see the goat. For a 10-minute interview, a 10-minute conversation, a lens that relies on an average of 5 pieces of exposition is the sweet spot. This interviewee, MPS, achieved a mean concurrence of 0.8. Each respondent shared at least some meeting understanding with an average of 80% of other respondents. As an aside, you'll notice that MPS didn't actually manage to communicate their intended message to anyone in their audience. That's because the audience appeared to assign value to information based on character fortune and narrative tension. The vast majority of responses assigned importance to information conveyed in moments when extremes in character fortune aligned with peaks in narrative tension. To be more specific, just over 80% of responses included information from those moments. That's 4 in 5 audience members. The significance is that the peak in narrative tension elicits an emotional response from the audience, and the extreme, either a peak or trough in character fortune, validates that emotion by communicating that the character, in this case the scientist, feels the same as the audience. That creates a confirmation bias, which makes the audience more willing to assign importance to the information conveyed in the story. That's my theory, anyway. Back to the point. Collapsing the textual superposition such that we achieve consistently high meeting understanding is all well and good. But the audience needs to see something that's actually relevant to them through the lens we construct. So how do we do that? How do we construct an accessible lens to collapse the textual superposition into an accessible state? Well, I've got a picture of a tree, and I'm going to talk about it. We can consider this tree to be some person's reality, with the trunk and the larger branches being the largest groups and communities they belong to, and the smaller branches being smaller communities, all the way up to things that only they know. The dark shadows of the tree are the person's consensus reality with someone else. You can see that there are large interconnected areas, but there are other areas that seem completely disconnected. They're not, though. The other person just connects those ideas in different ways. That can already be a significant barrier to communication. When you think that it's obvious that A leads to B leads to C, but the other person you're talking to thinks it's far more obvious that A leads to B leads to G, it can get confusing. So, what are some strategies we can employ? One thing we can do is throw down a ladder, made entirely out of facts about ourselves and our own interests. It's certainly an easy option, but it will produce a mostly authorial lens, which prioritizes your intent and largely ignores your audience's interpretation. Some people might be into that, but a lot of people will be asking why they should care, since the topic doesn't seem to be relevant to them. Another option is to hold the audience's hand and guide them through your reality, giving them time to process everything they learn and add it to their reality on their own terms. That will allow the audience to construct their own lens through which to view the conversation, meaning they set the textual superposition. It's extraordinarily accessible, but it's not always practical, because what I just described isn't communication, it's education, or at least an idealized form of education. Education is slow and sometimes tedious, but it does at least let students decide for themselves how to interpret the knowledge they gain. We could also meet our audience halfway. We could accept information from their reality into our consensus reality at the same time as they accept information from our reality into theirs. As many people watching this video will already know, that's co-creation. Or at least it can be if you're just as willing to be an audience as you are to be a communicator. To make this work, you need to be open to both accepting and receiving messages. Co-creation produces a mixed authorial and contextual lens, and can often bring in other basis positionalities too, especially if you're communicating with people outside the communities you spend most of your time in. These aren't the only approaches you can take either. There are an infinite number of ways to communicate and an infinite number of textual superpositions, or technically infinity minus 7 if we're being all mathematical about it. Depending on the path you choose, you might construct a lens that includes any or all of the basis positionalities I outlined at the start of this video, or you might use none of them and find a completely new way to express your ideas. Regardless of all that, my research has raised more questions than it answered. How does the effect of exposition change with longer or shorter conversations? Instead of an interview, what if it was a lecture? What if it was text instead of film? What about comics? What about any other medium? Would the ideal expositional reliance increase or decrease in those situations? How does the audience change the effect? If the audience is already interested in the topic, does the ideal expositional reliance increase? If they're particularly disinterested, does it decrease? How does time factor into it? The respondents gave their interpretations immediately after they watched the interviews. What if they'd answered a week later? Would their answers change? Would they retain anything at all? Does social interaction make any difference? If the respondents gave their interpretations in focus groups rather than surveys, would their conversations with other participants change their answers? There are so many questions, it's hard to even consider where to begin. No matter what, though, this research leaves us with one very important message. Make your exposition count, because you can't take it back.